Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Keeping Current Tips and Tricks for Policy Updates. I have just a few housekeeping notes to mention. Number one, if you have any sound or technical issues today, please let me know in the chat box with a direct message, and I'll do my best to help you out. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording, along with a PDF version of the slideshow, will be sent out to all registrants within the next week or so. And finally, we do have some built-in time at the end to answer any questions that may come up, but please feel free to type them in the chat box at any point throughout the presentation. Now, before we get started, I just wanted to share a little bit about the Documentary Heritage Preservation Services for New York, for those of you who might not know of us. DIPSNY, as we like to call it, is a collaboration between the New York State Archives and the New York State Library, with services provided by the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. DIPSNY is a statewide program that provides free planning and education services to support the vast network of collecting institutions, such as archives, libraries, historical societies, museums, and other organizations that safeguard and ensure access to New York's historical records and library research materials. DIPSNY services include archival needs assessments, preservation and condition surveys, strategic planning assistance, and access to a variety of educational programs, such as this webinar. To learn more about our services, please visit dhpsny.org. And with that, I pass this along to today's presenter, Mandy Shepp.
Sorry, I totally tried the keyboard shortcut and it did not work. Hello. I am Mandy Shepp. I am the coordinator for special collections and archives at Reed Library at SUNY Fredonia. I have been there for 4 years now, and I have written a lot of policies during my time, and I've learned a lot about them in my years of library experience. Before I started at Fredonia, I worked at Lilydale. I was the library director there, and when I started, they needed a lot of policy work. So this has just kind of been my weird little jam for a while. And it's been, it's worthwhile. I know it's like tough to get started in. And that's kind of why I'm here to give you some ideas of how to make this process go better. So let's get down to it. Policies 101. So keeping current with policies is important for all collecting institutions, no matter what their size is. They provide a neutral or objective resource for staff and administration to point to when any questions or issues need to be resolved. Policies really should have the longevity beyond the current staff who created them in mind. This kind of helps guide the operations of this collecting institution for beyond a certain point. Maintaining policies is also a good way to keep up with our profession, the evolving changes in librarianship and the GLAM field, and the changing times that we live in the world around us. I'm sure none of us really had pandemic-related policies before 2020. Policies regarding safe spaces and diversity are coming up a lot more in recent times. And really show to reflect the library's place in the community, and kind of make those standards in our profession a bit more consistent with institutions. Policies can also be guided by larger professional bodies like your ALA Code of Ethics, your RBMS guidelines, ACRL guidelines, to kind of provide these neutral, consistent foundations for all institutions. These guidelines can also serve to prevent one single opinion from really guiding the policy tone, which is important. The purpose of policies isn't really to be nitpicky or rules lawyery. It's really to create a consistent set of standards in order for operations to flow smoothly between changes. Basic policies that every single collecting institute should really have. Everybody needs a collection development and management policy. It's really the foundation of how your collections get built. It also can guide how your collections are evaluated and assessed. It also can guide how deaccessions or transfers or weeding can work. So it really outlines a lot of your basic policies for working with these materials. It can also include guidance on donations, which should be addressed ideally in your Section A, how collections are built. Guidance for weeded materials, which can be brought up in your transfers or how your weeding works, and timetables for collection activities, like how often are you weeding, how often are you doing assessments, do you access things regularly, or are you kind of a when donations come in sort of place? I have definitely been in both places, and policies can really help. I've dealt with a lot of really passionate donors at Lilydale, and kind of helping communicate what our needs are can be really fruitful for institutions that rely on donations. Policies can also include information on circulation, your loans, your ILL, your exhibitions, and these can be kind of fleshed out separately as part of an exhibitions and loan policy, which is sort of an optional policy, but still good if that's the thing that you're doing. You should also have a digital collections or digital assets management policy. This is kind of like a collection development management policy, but it's basically for digital collections. In the digital world, though, the timetable element of this policy is very critical. This policy would also guide like your development and digitization of collections. Like, are you, doing native digital content? Are you doing other digital collections? Do you have a lot of digitization projects on the docket that you really need to, provide some structure for? And digitizations can also be part of a separate policy or rolled into your digital collections policy. The other thing you also need, everybody should have, they're not fun, they're kind of intimidating, but they're necessary, is a disaster or emergency plan. These are usually the toughest ones. They involve a lot of communication with your staff, possibly some training or drills for people that may or not be directly involved with your collecting institution. Ideally, this would involve other departments outside your institution, like when I've been in the process of updating ours for a while, and it really involves a lot of communications with like facilities and building people, because we're part of a campus and we're not the only building, and that kind of stuff definitely takes a lot of time to fully incorporate. It can also impede your planning process, like I was just saying. So teamwork and making sure that you guys can communicate is really the most important piece of this. Your disaster policy should be checked and updated often, and there are a lot of great resources on this, which I will get to later. You should also have a patron reading room, public area, some sort of policy like that, that guides how patrons should interact with your collections and spaces. This can also provide a lot of guidance to preserve your collections while they're in use. It can be a part of your preservation plan or your preservation policy, which again, optional, not every institution needs one. Your patron policy also can kind of help establish a tone for your institution and give it and your collections kind of a voice to defend themselves. Like, this is how you should be using these things. This is how to not use these things. It's really helpful to communicate, because if you think that people won't do it, or that it's, a natural thing, someone will prove you wrong. I've had to definitely write specific things of, do not stand on chairs to photograph books, because people have totally done that for whatever reason. Finally, if you're working with volunteers or student workers, you should absolutely have a policy to help set expectations for them. These can also serve to help establish workflows and guidelines for projects and help manage staffing, like who do they report to? How can you determine when their project is done? That sort of stuff. So let's talk about assessing policies and when to update, or how to update them, and when updating them is not a faction or an option. I'm sorry. Also, I apologize if you can hear tiny meows. My cat made it into this room and there are vocals. I'm very sorry. So these are questions that I like to ask when we're looking at a policy that needs updating. First, I like to ask how fleshed out this policy is, how fully formed. Is it skeletal? Is it kind of an outline? Does it need some body built into it? Or is it fully formed and just needs some adjustments? Are the fully formed portions of this still relevant? Can this outline be further expanded if it's still skeletal? Policies don't really need to be a bazillion pages long. You're not making, you know, a tome. You're basically just making a document that is easy to navigate, that people can refer to. That should be the goal. And it should cover all relevant aspects of the issue that's at hand here. You should also be asking if there are any significant changes in your institution since this was last written or updated. Are the staff referred to in the policy still working there? Do their positions still exist? Are you referencing that you need to talk to the computer disk librarian who hasn't existed in 20 years? Or, you know, have your staff numbers significantly changed? Was this policy written when you had 30 staff members, but now you have 9? How does that change? How do those responsibilities get affected? Changes in your collections or your spaces or your equipment. Are these collection spaces and equipment still here? We've had the big kicker to start our updates to our disaster and emergency policy were when I found the last one that we had, which was written in 1981. So they had interesting directives in this policy, like save the floppy disks, leave all the computers, the collections will be fine, we'll get to them later, but you must save the floppy disks. So things like that. There were a lot of references in that policy as well to like taking collections from a room that doesn't exist anymore. It's not serving that same purpose. Or have your rare books moved? Have you moved things? So that's something you should absolutely keep in mind. And does the opinion of the profession still kind of align with the standards and practices outlined in this policy? Is the language up to date? Are there things that could be changed for easier readability or easier accessibility? Does the policy still reflect or communicate the needs of your institution or the goals in any of your mission and vision statements? Or has your patron community changed significantly? So these are all kinds of things that I like to build into my assessment process. And then sometimes you need to start over. This is hopefully something that doesn't happen all the time. It is absolutely happening with our disaster plan, which is why it's taking so long. But you should ask yourself how much of this policy needs to be changed. If my rule of thumb personally is when you need to change more than 2/3 of a policy, it's probably time to start over from scratch. You can still keep any relevant parts, or if there are pieces that are particularly well worded or really capture a need, I mean, that's always fine. There's no like law against it. Also, how much time has been passed since this policy was last written or was created? If it's been more than 10 years, it's probably time to start over. A lot happens in a decade. So there are definitely things that could be Like think about the changes in technology that take place over a decade. We're prioritizing a lot more different elements of technology than we were before. We're not saving the floppy disks anymore. We're probably not even saving the computers anymore because it's backed up to the cloud. So differences. And you know, if you're looking at these things and you have enough significant changes to your collections or your staff or your spaces, it's probably time to start over. So now that you have asked yourself these assessment questions on your policy, let's talk about how to start revising. And sometimes during the process of revision, it's a little bit easier to just start with something fresh. So discussions and communication are utterly critical to this process. When possible, assemble a team. I know that it's not always possible. When I worked at Lilydale, I did a lot of this by myself. I was writing the policy and I'd kind of run it by our executive director and our board of trustees to say, this is how I'd like to move forward. And we could have a discussion on that level, but it was largely me writing them as a way to say, these are the standards and practices of the profession. This is how it should be run. And I did a lot of referencing to professional standards and professional ethics to kind of establish, like, this isn't just me writing my voice and this isn't my like rambling list of demands for 19 pages. This is really something that will help in the long run to ensure the care of this place can continue. So that's kind of the eye I was writing it with. But a team allows you to ensure that all of the voices are heard and that issues are addressed from all perspectives. Sometimes addressing these other perspectives can kind of prevent other issues from happening further down the line. Like nothing is worse than, well, in policy writing anyway, than working really hard and presenting this glorious 20-page document to your staff and then going, well, what about, you know, this one patron issue, or what about this one little thing that isn't included in this? And then you have to kind of rework a lot of pieces. So when I'm currently in an academic library, so although I'm special collections, I like to make sure I have input from other people in the library that aren't in special collections, from the library director, from members of administration, and then even some like faculty advising as well. So I like to see what members of my community think about this. So it's kind of up to you. There's no right or wrong for a committee. It's kind of a case by case per institution. So whatever works best for you in your case. But having another set of eyes on it is always a good thing, as with, you know, every document. Collaborative documents are awesome for this. They're really helpful. They ensure that everybody can kind of work at their own pace and leave comments where and when it's needed. If you have people that work different shifts, or you have people that work on weekends when you don't, sometimes it can be hard to schedule a meeting. And I feel like in cases like this, sometimes meetings aren't the most helpful thing. I feel like seeing everything in writing and having the ability to take a look at it and really reflect on what's there and communicate your needs and communicate your ideas through comments or suggestions or discussion that way can be really helpful. Because writing it's a group project, but it's sort of an individual process, if that makes sense. During this collaborative document process, you should also make sure to read your policy as a whole, kind of fairly often, to make sure that it really gels together, like it makes sense front to back as a document. It shouldn't really, to offhandedly quote Beetlejuice, it shouldn't read like stereo instructions. It should be clear and concise and make sense. And also in collaborative things. Sometimes you can get repetitive portions of a document if there's a point you're stuck on or you're trying to communicate it well. You need to make sure the point's made but not overdone. You don't want to see the same thing pop up throughout the document because, you know, no one wants to really read anything that's repetitive like that. It also makes it confusing to reference if things aren't really clear and fluid in their flow. You have to ensure your policy kind of meets the needs of your institution. These policies aren't just for your like one person. It's not for, you know, the director. When I write archives policies, they're not for me. They are for the campus. They are for my institution. And I want to make sure that my policies are expressing the same sentiment as the vision statement and mission statement of my campus. And also these kind of affect the entire institution. Like, for example, the disaster policy. If you write a fabulous disaster policy, that's awesome. But if you are the only one that knows how it works or what needs to happen in the face of an emergency, that is totally not going to help when an actual emergency arises and no one knows what to do. So you want to be able to communicate your plan and make sure that your institution is on board with your policies that you've written, so they aren't, you know, surprised when these get referenced in the future. And as always, I mean, you got to do your best to plan ahead, but nobody can think of everything at one time. Communication is key. Multiple perspectives really help communicate the needs of a wider policy. There are some questions that you can ask to evaluate the old policy or the issue at hand to determine the major needs that should be communicated in the new policy. So you want to know what is the goal of this policy? What needs changing? What needs to be made clear under the new guidelines? What purpose does this serve for your collections or your institution? Like if you have, you know, if you don't really have a strong body of digital objects, it doesn't really behoove you to stress really hard over a fantastic collection policy for digital objects. So it's sort of, again, every institution is different and every institution is going to have different policy needs and every institution will have different policies. But as long as you have your basics covered, you should be good. And then also, while you are creating or updating your policies, there are a lot of resources that are available. You don't need to reinvent the wheel or start from scratch in every case. There are a lot of really well-established guidelines that keep our professional standards consistent across our institutions so that, you know, you can establish a baseline patron experience. What should anybody expect when they go to a museum? What should that experience be like? Or visit our spaces, like my experience at Lilydale, if you have well-meaning patrons that really want to help out and donate or volunteer, it can help create guidelines for them to make sure that your institution can, you know, run to the best of its ability. So there are a lot of resources that are available for institutions that can kind of help clarify standards in the GLAM field. There are, and I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about them. The Society of American Archivists, their standards and best practices page kind of outlines, you know, what the code of ethics for archives, what sort of standards you should be experiencing. They really do keep very current in terms of like social issues and what's going on in the world. So they have a lot of really lovely guidelines about DEI and acknowledgements, things like that, language, creating neutral language and finding aids. So there's a lot of really excellent resources that are available. They also make a specialized museum archives guidelines that can kind of help guide your policies in terms of schedules for preservation maintenance and assessment, things like that. There are also guidelines and standards from the Rare Books and Manuscripts section of the Association for College Resources and Libraries. They kind of help guide rare books and special collections departments. They have a lot of very varied things on like security in your special collections and archives areas, collection policies, digitization policies, preservation guidelines. They also have, they and all of these pages also have a lot of really excellent resources for educating yourself, webinars in terms of how to learn more about building these policies and stuff. So they are good sources to check out. RBMS also has guidelines on things like exhibition and loan. So if you're an institution that wants to start loaning or circulating your special collections and archives materials, they can give you really good guidelines on how that works. The American Association of Museums, Ethics Standards and Professional Practices gives a lot of really great guidelines that are museum centric. And the ALA standards and guidelines also provide general like library guidelines. I turn to them for a lot of things like patron policies and digital collections type stuff, because some of them have pretty good outlines for how those things should be structured. There are also numerous policy related webinars. I know I have taken wonderful ones on disaster and emergency policies from DIPSNY. Just a little shout out. Woo. So how do we prevent this from happening again? Now that we're all prepared on writing our policies and doing things with our policies, how can we kind of build in some sort of, fail safe for, the next generation of staff being like, well, it's been 15 years since anybody's touched the collections policy. Oh my. And as people can do. So once your policy is created or updated, there should be kind of a revisiting or a review schedule baked into your policy to kind of ensure that there are some regular, revisions, regular readings of it. People are checking back in on it and, not just going, well, it exists, dust off our hands, it's done, we never have to do it again. No. You should definitely continue to look at it. So policies, as again, this is my general kind of rule that I go by. Policies should really be assessed every 1 to 2 years, depending on the policy. For me, like collection policies, I like to take a look at those every couple of years, especially if there are significant changes. If we got a lot of like a significant acquisition that really requires some kind of change to be made to the policy or how it functions. Some donors kind of have insistence that certain policies go along with collection donations. So that's a thing to be aware of as well. I would also suggest, again, my rule, people related policies, I like to revisit every year. So people related as in like my volunteer or student worker policies, I like to look at those every year, make sure that they're still expressing what I want. Same thing with patron policies or reading room policies. I like to look at those every year and see if there are any changes that I see that need to be made, like how people are using my spaces, how it kind of pans out when people are following the rules. Perhaps there's something you didn't foresee that should be addressed. And then also every time you have a big change in your institution, you should be reassessing and revisiting your policies. So if you have major staff changes, like your director retires, or spatial changes, like you did a huge construction project and built an extension or a new room or a storage space was redone, major collection changes, if you, like I was saying, with new acquisitions and donors, or say you de-accessed a large digital collection, maybe you don't need to have as tight of a digital collections policy now that you don't have this thing that needs a lot of fine tuning anymore. Or major institutional changes. Has there been a major change in how your department is overseen or in how your institution is operated? Do you have a new board of trustees that's shaking things up? Perhaps you need to revisit your policies. Same thing. Also, just as a default, anytime we are addressing our mission statement or vision statement, or if we have a strategic planning thing, I like to bring up policies as a part of those efforts to make sure that everything that kind of suggests the workflows and operations of our institution should be assessed all at the same time. Because it doesn't really make sense if you're making all these beautiful longevity plans and your policy is super outdated. And that is the bulk of what I have, and I'm happy to answer questions.
All right, let's just give folks a minute to type their questions into the chat box. All right, so we have our first question. Should policies be posted on your website or available to the public in any way?
Okay, so I have, in my experience, it depends on the policy. There are a lot of, so I am a full believer in transparency. I like to make my policies available because I believe that that positively affects how people interact with my institution. If I make my collection development policy clear and people understand how I process donations or how what my collection strengths are or what my collection weaknesses are, I think that there's a good benefit to that. And then also like your patron policy, your reading room policy, public space policies, absolutely, those should be made public. People should know what to expect when they visit your institution. And I also like to make, like my volunteer policy, I like to make public so that people can, you know, make an educated decision as to whether or not they'd like to volunteer or spend time in this environment. And also, if anyone is curious, I have my collection development management policy available. If anyone wants to see what one of those can kind of look like. If you want to let me know in the chat, feel free.
All right, our next question. What complexity of policies do you recommend for very small museums run entirely by volunteers?
I have been in this situation. So you don't have to get super duper complex if you are a small institution. You should have something in place that at least makes a set of guidelines or a set of guiding statements. What you basically want is how we do what we do and why kind of distilled into a document. Like, why does this organization exist? You want to make that clear. What are we doing? What is the purpose of us? You want to make that clear. And then if there are things, especially smaller volunteer run institutions, the experience that I've had is sometimes communication can be an issue. Or if you get a new volunteer that wants to like shake things up. Sorry, I've had a lot of bad experiences with people that want to shake things up. So it's not always a bad thing. I'm not afraid of new ideas. I just, making sure that everyone's on the same page is super important, especially when you're doing a team, when you're working with a team of volunteers. So as long as you have like your basics, your collection development policy or management policy, if you, especially if you're a small volunteer run organization, you should have like a volunteer policy, maybe a patron, like public spaces policy, how that works. And then once you have your foundations, you can kind of go from there. Like, do you want to exhibit your stuff? Maybe you should have a couple paragraphs in your collection management policy about how long stuff stays on exhibit, who's responsible for them, that sort of thing. And then that kind of creates just a small basic platform that can be consistent throughout the years for your small institution. I hope that was helpful.
This next question is for me, but I will answer it out loud so everyone is aware. From what email address will the slides and recording be sent? So that email will be coming from the email that is on your screen right now, that info@dhpsny.org, and that'll be coming out within the next week or so. And it looks like a lot of folks would love to see your policy.
Okay.
We got quite a few comments about that. So I don't know if that's something you would like to share now, or if you'd rather send it out with that email. Totally up to you.
Okay, I can do that. Can we see my policy? Is it up?
Yep, I can see it.
Perfect. Okay, so this is what I have for mine. It's pretty basic. It's 18 pages, which is intimidating, but there is a reason for this. So I can kind of go through it and show you what I've got. So I have our introduction, which kind of provides, the basic who are we and why. I like to put a statement about our audience. So, who is our patron campus, or who is our patron community, which kind of gives the reasoning for some of the extended coverage described in some of these. I like to do a mission statement because that kind of helps provide a small statement that guides the rest of the policy. You can refer back to this as well. Collection objectives, what you want your collection to do, how you'd like to see people using it, that sort of thing. I like to include an intellectual freedom statement. I feel like it's just a nice standard for libraries, especially to include. So you can just kind of say, we're a collecting institution. We have a variety of perspectives. That's what we have here. Your general selection criteria, just basically why do you want this stuff? How do you choose whether you want this stuff? What makes this stuff good or bad? And then I like to outline our collections. So this thing that goes on for a few pages, which is the bulk of my policy, honestly, is a bit of individualized information about each collection that we have in our care, how they're structured, for a little bit of background on why this is so intense looking. When I first arrived at Fredonia, our collections were just kind of numbered 1 through 88, and it didn't encompass all of them. It didn't really allow for growth in any way. And it was really overwhelming for me. to just see like, here is the list of all the collections. There's no grouping. You don't know what anything is. And then when you're new and you have some patron come in and say, hey, do you have anything that relates to, industry in Jamestown? And you just go, maybe. So it really helps kind of guide, what these collections are. What are you collecting about? What are your subjects? That sort of thing. So this is our signature collections. These are our big things that we're known for, like the Stefan Zweig collection, the Rasher collection, Holland Land Company stuff. And then it provides a bit of scope about those collections, like your collecting scope, your chronological scope. How big is this collection? So people can see like, okay, you got a lot of things on this. Maybe I shouldn't donate my Zweig book from, college. And then you can kind of talk more about your digital aspects, your media aspects, what languages these collections are in, that sort of thing. And then I divided this into local history. And again, gives you scope, stuff like that. So you can, when you're presented with a donation or an acquisition, you can really assess it in comparison to this sort of document and say, okay, this is well within our chronological scope. It's within this. It's not, a bazillion linear feet of material, so we can actually include it. And it can really help you make educated decisions with that kind of stuff. Because sometimes in the heat of the moment, or you get a sweet puppy-eyed donor that's like, I need someplace to put my thousands of books, and you go, oh my God, I wish I could help you, but no. So it's helpful in emotional situations like that for me, to be able to say, this is why I can't, I am so sorry, but maybe here is somewhere else that could be suitable for you. And then also it kind of helps assess gaps in our collection. Like we have like our university collections, which is what this portion is. We can see what departments we're not collecting from. So I can reach out to those departments and say, hey, you're kind of lacking a presence in our archives. Is there a way that I can better represent your department in the history of our campus? So they kind of help in that method. And then once I get beyond all of this, forever, I'm sorry. I have my special collections kind of outlined in my individual manuscripts. So I can talk about that sort of thing. These are special collections where you can talk about what each special collection is, what the scope is for it, how these collections kind of came to be. And then here we go. Here's the juicy stuff. So collection maintenance is my back end of it. I like to talk about my deselection procedures. So people are very upfront about, sometimes weeding happens even in special collections. You need places for that stuff to go, and you need a method, and you can't just, secret a box of books out of the library and be like, yes, I'm de-accessing these, wink. Like, no, you need some procedures for how this stuff works. There are professional ethics and things, which get referenced a lot in this section as well, as far as, deselecting for damage, deselecting for other things, what we do with these materials once they're deselected. Like, do you prioritize institutional transfer? Are you prioritizing recycling, or are you or repurposing? Sometimes if I have books that are super damaged or super damaged to the point where you really shouldn't use them, we have a class here that focuses on the history of bookmaking. So I've kind of developed a teaching library of blown apart books that kind of show what the various parts are. So, repurposing things and not just deaccessioning things when they're broken. Making it kind of work as best as I can. And then donation and gift policy. So how that sort of stuff works. This is also kind of in a donation policy, you can put kind of sort of a not like a wish list, like I would like a Shakespeare folio. But you can have, our collection could use some improvement in this area, something like that. Or you can also, this is also where you can kind of outline your why we want this donation over this donation, why we would like this over this. And then what happens to things that we don't want. Usually I will talk to the donor and give them back, that sort of a situation. And then restricted gifts, because that's sort of a thing that I feel like collecting institutions and historical institutions deal with, where I have this really cool thing, but you can only have it under these conditions. You can kind of have some power for your institution here in terms of how you want to handle that situation, which, you should really outline in a sort of policy in that way. And then also I like to include a comment on appraisals. At least for me, it is against my professional code of ethics to do any sort of appraisals of material. So if I have a donor that's like, hey, I gave you a whole bunch of books, can you write me a letter for my taxes? No, but there are people that I can refer them to instead. So that's really what it is. It is not really beautiful to read. It kind of looks, like a big, boring instructional document, but it is. But it should make sense. It should be cohesive, and it does kind of gel together when it's looking at holistically, if that makes sense.
So our next question is a two-parter. The first part is there any order in which policies should be revised? And the second part is, which ones, if any, should be prioritized over others?
So it kind of depends on your comfort level. Again, it's an individual sort of thing. So if you don't have any sort of collections policy, I would absolutely prioritize that, because that is kind of the meat of your institution. That's really what communicates your institutional identity and how your collections operate and how you operate. So I would prioritize that in any situation that you're able to. I would also, if you have no patron policy, I would prioritize that. But as far as, I kind of approached them anyway. When I was starting at Lilydale, there were 0 policies, absolutely nothing. So what I really wanted to do was get a hold on certain issues that I kept running into, like passionate doorstop donations. I would have a lady that would regularly leave me an enormous collection, like 7 grocery bags full of books, on the front door of the library overnight. Like, she would just come in at 3 a.m. and like drop them off, and they would just be there when I got in to open the building. And some of them were awesome, and some of them were not. So kind of writing something to communicate that sort of issue, or mitigate that sort of issue, can be helpful if that's something that you're facing. So you don't get overwhelmed by the issue that's really causing the need for the policy in the first place.
Okay, so it's actually looking like that was our last question. So with that, I would like to thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Mandy, for such an amazing presentation. I think this was a fabulous kickoff for our 2022 programming calendar.
Oh, thank you.
If you all enjoyed today's presentation and would like to learn more about our other educational offerings, please check out dhpsny.org/education. Thank you again, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day.